Hi, I'm Charlotte Moser, the co-director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Today on VEC Vaccine Notes, we're going to be talking about dengue. Dengue is caused by a virus that spreads through the bite of certain types of mosquitoes. While a dengue vaccine has been available in the United States since 2019, most people in the United States are not currently able to protect themselves against this viral infection through vaccination. And that's because the only available vaccine is no longer being produced. Now, 3 points about this are important. First, most people in the United States were not recommended to get this vaccine anyway. And we'll talk more about that when we discuss the vaccine in a few minutes. Second, even if some doses of vaccine were available to a person, people who've not already started their vaccine doses are essentially unable to get it because of the series of 3 doses that took a year to complete, and the remaining doses will expire during this calendar year in 2026. Finally, the remaining doses that are available tend to be in limited places like Puerto Rico, where rates of dengue are higher. Now, 2 other dengue vaccines have been approved in other countries, and several more are in clinical trials, but at this point it remains unclear when or if vaccines will be made available in the United States in the future. During the next little bit, we'll talk about dengue, the vaccine, common questions we get here at the Vaccine Education Center, and the relative risks of this disease. So let's get to it. Dengue viruses are from the family of viruses called flaviviruses. They're closely related to other viruses carried by ticks or mosquitoes, like yellow fever virus, West Nile virus, and Zika virus. The disease is caused by 4 closely related viruses referred to as types 1 to 4. An infection with one type of dengue virus does not provide protection against the other types. As a result, people can be infected up to 4 times throughout their life. And unfortunately, each infection increases the person's risk of experiencing severe disease. People with dengue infections can have different experiences. Some have no symptoms at all, while others can have life-threatening illness. Most commonly, the symptoms include a rapid onset of fever with a headache, pain behind the eyes, muscle and joint pain, a flushed face, which means the person either has a reddening or darkening of their skin, and their skin becomes warm to the touch. They can have a lack of appetite, abdominal pain and nausea, or a red flat rash that will develop over their entire body within about 3 to 4 days after the start of the fever. People with severe disease can also experience bleeding, organ failure, and shock. And in severe cases, early detection and comprehensive medical care, such as in an ICU, are important for survival. Now, when we talk about how dengue virus spreads, it's helpful to start with a brief reminder about the biology of mosquitoes. If you've learned about the mosquito life cycle at any point, you may recall that only female mosquitoes bite people. Of course, if you haven't thought much about mosquitoes, this may be surprising to you. The reason that only female mosquitoes bite is because in order to produce eggs, they require a protein that's found in human blood. Since our blood tends to clot quickly, a mosquito's saliva contains proteins to stop that clotting. As such, when they bite, their saliva mixes with the blood. Since dengue virus is also contained in their saliva, if they're infected, they can spread the virus to the person during this process. Similarly, if the person is infected with dengue, the virus is in their blood, so they can also spread dengue to the mosquito, which will then spread the virus to other people if the mosquito goes on to bite others. For dengue, we're specifically talking about 2 types of mosquitoes, known as Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. Both are commonly found in tropical and subtropical regions of the United States, places like Puerto Rico, American Samoa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. Globally, about half of the world's population lives in areas where dengue is common, As a result, each year about 400 million people get infected with dengue viruses. About 100 million of them experience symptoms, and about 40,000 of them die from their infections. Now, one thing that's interesting about dengue compared with most other infections is that the first dengue infection tends to be the most mild. Additional infections increase the likelihood of experiencing severe infections. So why is that? If you recall, when we get an infection, we develop an immune response against the pathogen that's infecting us. An important part of that immune response is antibodies. These are proteins that are secreted by B cells, and they typically bind to the pathogen so that it can't get into our cells. But with dengue, while the antibodies from the first infection can bind to the virus during subsequent infections, they don't actually prevent the virus from entering cells. In fact, they make it easier for the virus to enter our cells. This is a concept called antibody-dependent enhancement, or ADE. As a result of having antibodies against dengue, a person can actually have a more severe infection. This phenomenon called ADE also made designing a vaccine more difficult. And although scientists were able to overcome the issue, the result was a vaccine that was complicated to administer. While practices ensured that the vaccine was safe, the complexity limited its use. This was one of the reasons that the vaccine that was available in the United States stopped being made. So let's dive into the vaccine and talk a little bit more about this. First, it's important to know that because we didn't have a vaccine for many years, historically protection strategies have focused on controlling the mosquito population and using personal protective measures like applying insect repellent, wearing long-sleeve clothing and pants, and using mosquito nets. Even when we had a vaccine, it was limited in use to very specific groups, so these measures continued to be important. Now, when a vaccine was available, a person had to meet 3 specific criteria to be eligible for vaccination. First, they had to live in one of those areas that are high risk, as we discussed. Travelers to those areas were not recommended for vaccination, nor were people who lived in areas in other parts of the country. Second, the individuals needed to be between 9 and 16 years of age, and we'll talk about why in a moment. And they've had to have had a previous dengue infection that was either confirmed by testing when they were ill or confirmed by a blood test at the time when they were seeking vaccination. Now, these criteria were so specific because of that risk for ADE. By the time a child was 9 years of age, if they lived in a high-risk area, they were likely to have had a previous infection that could be documented. And they were unlikely to have had multiple infections. So this was a window of opportunity where they could benefit from vaccination. In this case, when the second exposure was from the vaccine, the recipients could be protected against the more severe second infection that would have resulted if they were infected with a virus spreading in their community. The vaccine decreased the need for hospitalization in 8 of every 10 vaccine recipients, and it protected vaccinees for at least 6 years and likely longer. Now, the upper age limit of 16 was based on the fact that data in older people were limited. The vaccine was given as 3 doses, with the second dose being given 6 months after the first dose, and the third dose being given 12 months after the first dose. As we discussed, the length of time for these doses to be completed and the strict criteria for giving the vaccine, including that need for 2 initial visits, one to administer the test and one to get the first dose of vaccine if the person was eligible, really limited the use of this vaccine. Now, importantly, there is another vaccine that's used in some other countries, and it did not have the same need for preliminary testing, and it only required 2 doses separated by 3 months. So the combination of the limited use in the United States and a more convenient vaccine available in other countries is what led the company to stop making this vaccine. The vaccine was safe. The side effects were mild and lasted only a couple of days after vaccination. Side effects included things such as a headache, pain at the site where the vaccine was given, tiredness, weakness, and muscle aches. But again, I want to reiterate that it's really important to realize that this vaccine did not stop being available because of safety concerns, but rather other extenuating circumstances. Okay, so let's turn our attention to some of the questions we've received here at the Vaccine Education Center. Some people wonder why the vaccine was given at specific ages. And we did already talk about this, so we won't go through that again, other than to say that the younger end of the age range, 9 years old, was chosen based on the likelihood that a child had been exposed to dengue virus. And the older end of the age range, 16 years of age, was based on the limited data in older age groups. Some people also wondered why a person had to have a previous infection before vaccination. And we've already discussed this as well. That was due to that concept of antibody-dependent enhancement, or ADE, which can occur with dengue infection. In fact, when the vaccine was tested, it was tested in children in the Philippines. Some of the children in the study had previously been infected with dengue and others had not. And as these children were monitored, some who had been vaccinated ended up in the hospital. So scientists looked at who was ending up in the hospital. And what they found was that the children that were getting hospitalized were in the group that had not been exposed to the virus prior to vaccination. So it was this understanding that really led to those strict requirements for confirming a previous infection before vaccination. Another question we get is how to know whether a child has previously been infected with dengue. And as we mentioned, there is a blood test for this. If you have questions or concerns, we recommend talking with your child's healthcare provider. Finally, people wonder whether they should get the dengue vaccine if they're traveling. And of course, at this time, that's not even an option in the United States. But when the vaccine was available, vaccination was still not recommended for travelers. Okay, so let's finish up with a look at the risks and benefits. Since dengue vaccine is essentially no longer available in the United States, people who've started this series are able to get remaining doses, but other people are not able to access the vaccine. If they think they're going to be exposed to the virus, they need to take preventive cautions to protect themselves, the same way they would for any other mosquito-borne pathogen. This means things like using mosquito netting and insect repellent, and wearing clothing that covers their arms and legs when they're in areas at risk for exposure to dengue virus. Hopefully at some point we will again have a vaccine option, particularly for people who live in areas of the United States where dengue is more common. Thanks for listening today.